Hello everyone, it's Marianne from Yarnwork Studio, and today we are going to talk about one of those topics that everyone hates to talk about but is so important. We're going to talk about gauge swatching and how to adjust a pattern if the gauge isn't working out exactly as you need it to. So just before we get started, I have a whole whiteboard full of math here that hopefully will help us in this conversation. You guys know I'm not editing anymore. I'm just going to talk it through. So I wanted to touch on why we're talking about it. I cast on this sweater. This is the new broom? Yeah, no, it must be called broom. I don't think I've said it out loud yet. From Andrew Mowry. And when I saw it, I had this yarn in my stash and I was like, this is the perfect sweater for this stash that I've had that I want to use in something. It's very soft. It's very nice. But then I did what I think a lot of people do, which is dive right in without a gauge swatch because I wanted to just see how it goes. Because when you start with a neckline like this, often the neck has the same number of stitch count for very many sizes. So I'm like, you know what, I'll just go for it and see how it goes. And obviously, because we're here talking, it didn't go great. And I want to talk about why and how I made different decisions on how I'm going to move forward. Don't panic. I've got just loose stitches here because this is going to get frogged. But before I frogged it and pulled it all out, I thought, hey, why not tell people about it to share what I've learned? So once I start knitting here into this sort of main stockinette, which is what the most of the sweater is stockinette, that's when I decided to stop and check my gauge. And I don't want to check it like really close to changes here. I want it to be a nice big section of stockinette so that it's showing me how I'm actually knitting. So then I take my ruler here, which has basically inches across the top. That's what I'm going to be using this one for. Don't worry about the rest of it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to be counting, and I've obviously already done this because I've done all the math over here. But this is how you count what your stitch gauge is, which is how many stitches you have in a 4-inch, usually 4-inch period. So you just count the V's, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. It's about 20 and a half. And now remember, I have not blocked this. So for people who don't know what blocking is, that's where you do give it its first wash and you set the stitches in place. Usually it blooms or grows a little bit, but don't worry, I've got all the information on that in my handy little thing that I'm going to get to in a second. So that's how I'm talking about stitch count. And I'm only talking about stitch gauge, which is how many stitches you do this way. I'm not worried about row gauge. I can cover that separately, but that's kind of how long something is. The way a lot of Andrew's patterns are written, which is why I love them, is they talk more about, knit to a certain size, a certain length. So you don't have to worry about row gauge as much on some patterns, not all patterns. Okay, so I realized that this was off and I was like, let me do some math to see how off it's going to be. And this is where we're going to start talking about the math that I have on this board. And then we're going to talk about this guy, which is my gauge swatch that I did after this. So we're going to talk about why I decided I needed to do a gauge swatch. Okay. So hopefully this comes through okay. You can see my light. That's just my overhead light. Doesn't look great, but don't worry. The stuff that we need is up here. So with my 5mm hook, which is what I used to make this one, pre-block, so I haven't washed it and set it yet, I had 20.5 stitches in a 4-inch measurement, okay? Now, when I wanted to see what is that sweater size going to end up being for me, because it's wrong, right? Sorry, I should have said that. The pattern gauge calls for 17 stitches in 4 inches, and I've got 20.5 stitches in 4 inches. So that means that my sweater is going to be smaller. And sometimes this is hard to wrap your head around, but if your gauge, you have more stitches in the same amount of space, that means your overall sweater is going to be smaller. So it's calling for 17. And in this pattern, sizes. So these are the inches of the bust measurement that the pattern has. And it's got a lot. I'm not going to count them. 9, 10, I don't know, something like that. And for me, my bust is a size 42 inch around. It's sort of the widest part of my bust. This pattern looks for 6 to 10 inches of positive ease, which means add that to the 42 and your target sort of range for the sweater is that. So 42 plus 6 is 48. 42 plus 10 is 52. So my target range that I want my finished sweater to be, once I've blocked it and washed it and everything, is 48 to 52 inches, because that will have sort of the intended look of the sweater. I can play with that if I want to. If I want it to be tighter, I can make it smaller, maybe like 46. If I want it to be looser, I can go higher. But this is generally what's recommended for the pattern. And when you go off of that, it's going to maybe have a different finished look, and you need to be okay with that. So there happens to be size 1, 2, 3, 4 is a 48-inch finished circumference when it's blocked and everything. And size 5 is 52. So this is the range I want to play in. So I'd originally started with a 5mm hook, which gave me this stitch gauge, and I started with the size 48, which is this size here, size 4. So when I started doing it, and I'm just going to push this up a little bit, when I started knitting it, the 5mm plus 48-inch pattern size, so this combination of this here and this size, what is that going to mean for the actual finished item? Because again, the finished item was based on a 17 stitch gauge, and I'm at a 20.5. So what that's going to mean, oh, here we go. I totally forgot a step. So let me back up. Am I going to restart? No, I don't think I'm going to restart. I'm just going to back up 1 second. It's easy. So afterwards, obviously, I decided I needed a different size or something. So I did listen to me. I did a swatch. This is a swatch. I really didn't care about row gauge, or I would have probably made it a little bit taller. But this is a swatch. You need to make sure it's at least 4 inches kind of in the middle. I did 30 stitches across, and I'm not going to count here because I've shown you how to count. But I ended up with, using a 6mm hook instead of a 5 that I used on here, 5mm, I ended up with 18.5 stitches in 4 inches. And then I blocked it, which means that I put it in water the same way I would a finished sweater. I put in water, let it soak, and then pinned it out a little bit and dried it. So that let me know that after I blocked it, I ended up with 17.5 stitches. So that means when I blocked it, the stitches bloomed and grew a little bit from beforehand, which is normal, and that's what's expected. So it means that it went down. So that means with a 6mm hook, I'm at 17.5 stitches per 4 inches, which is pretty close to 17. But what I could use by that is I could say also, it started at 18.5 and then I blocked it, which is washing it, and it ended up being 17.5. Which means I had a 5% loss. And you can divide that out. You can say like 17.5 out of 18.5 is like 95% roughly. Or you could say 18.5 divided by 17.5 equals 1.05. So either way you slice it, you end up with a 5% loss, which means that if I block this piece, which was with the 5mm hook and had 20.5 stitches per 4 inch, I can actually expect it to lose 5% of that, roughly. So I'm using 19.5 as the actual size of this post-block gauge. And remember, post-block is after it's washed. That's what the finished garment will have. And why does this matter? Okay, so now we're going to get into it. Let's see if I can do it like this. So for my 5mm, which is this one that I started, and my intended outcome of 48 inches based on the pattern, I want to calculate, instead of it being 48 inches, because this is a different gauge, I want to see what the actual circumference will be. So the actual size, oh, the light just changed in here. No worries. I'm casting a big shadow from my body too. I'm not good at video, guys. I'm just here to explain. Okay, so the actual size, what you do is take the pattern gauge, which is 17 stitches per 4 inches, divide it by the actual gauge that you're getting, which is 19.5 post-blocked, because I want to see what the finished garment's going to end up being. Again, that's taking into account that we lost 5%. Well, we didn't lose it, but just 5% of it when we blocked it and washed it. So we took this, 5% of that is this, roughly. Okay. So pattern gauge per 4 inches divided by actual gauge, finished gauge, for 4 inches. and then times it by the number of inches. Okay. So the 48-inch sweater that I'm supposed to end up with, when I use this 5mm hook based on this gauge here, is going to give me 42 inches finished bust. Which you might say, hey, that's great because I'm actually a 42-inch bust. Except I'm supposed to have 6 to 10 inches of ease. If I do it 42 inches, so if I finish this as is, I will end up with a 42-inch roughly bust, which means it's going to be tight on me. It's going to be basically, there's going to be no give, no relaxation in it compared to what I want, which I want it to be a little bit looser, flowier. And for me, honestly, because of my body seasons right now, I want it to be a little bit bigger so it kind of hides a little bit of my tummy that's going on. So I'll end up with 42 inches. And you can also use this math. So hopefully that makes sense. You can use this math as well to determine if you do 17 over 19.5. I don't remember what it is exactly. I think it's around 87%. So it means that the size that I make is only going to be 87% of the intended end size. So I would need to actually knit with this combination of needles, the 5mm needles. I would need to knit this 56-inch pattern. So all the stitch counts and stuff for that in order to end up with a 48-inch finished garment. And I don't like some people can, I don't like to knit too far outside of the range of what I should be knitting because the rest of the grading of a pattern. So grading is like how it fits on the body, how measurements grow and scale as you get into bigger sizes. Because it's not just like you just, add 4 inches to everything as you go through these sizes, because our bodies don't add 4 inches everywhere. You'd end up with sleeves that are like giant balloons and stuff like that. So there's grading that goes into pattern design and development that everything's not just linear. So if I made this 56, I could do it. I would have to make sure that I actually am comfortable with doing it. And I would be a little bit skeptical of the pattern. I would be doing a lot of checks and math throughout, which I don't really want to do. And you'd have to make sure that you have enough yarn for it, which I cannot guarantee. Actually, I know for sure I don't have enough of this stash yarn, which I love, by the way. This is Bramble Ridge, dyed in BC, Canada. I love my Canadians because I am one too. And this is called Vanilla Bean, and this is in her DK that's part merino and a little bit of nylon. And I love it, and I just have had it sitting there waiting for the right thing. But I don't have enough skeins of it to do. I don't have the yardage to do this size anyways. So this option is out. I'm not going to continue on in the pattern the way that I'm doing. Okay, so that's why I ended up doing this swatch, because first of all, I wanted to see how much it grew with the actual blocking so that I could calculate this sort of loss up here. It's not really loss. I keep saying loss. Stitches don't disappear. You just get less in a 4-inch period. So now I have to first feel okay with what this fabric is at this higher needle size, because when you change needle sizes, it's not going to be quite as dense. It's going to be looser. I need to make sure that I'm okay with this fabric, how it's draping, make sure it's not too stiff. Usually if you go down in needle sizes, it might become stiffer. If you go up, it's going to become looser, not too see-through, and that I'm happy with the overall look. And I am with this. I would not definitely push any higher on the needle size. I would just have to find a different yarn probably to make this sweater effectively. But once I had this information, now I can figure out which of the sizes I want to actually make on my pattern. So I'm going to go up a little bit here so we can see it, try to straighten it to make nice clean edges, but it's never going to happen. Okay, so using the 6mm, which is what I used for this. This is a US 10, I think. 6mm, I'm choosing kind of between the 48 and the 52 inches, seeing what it actually will end up being. Because I know if I make the 48-inch size, it will not end up 48 inches. And the reason I know that is because the pattern is written for 17 stitches per 4 inches, and I'm at 17.5. So it's going to be smaller. Remember, if I'm getting more stitches in a 4-inch period than what they call for, when I finish, it's going to be smaller. So I know it's going to be smaller, not by much, but it's going to be smaller. So I want to see how much smaller. So again, I'm using that same math. So I'm taking the gauge from the pattern, which we know is 17. Am I pointing to something not here? No, you can see that. 17, dividing it by my actual gauge, which you can't see, which is 17.5, using the 6mm needles once it's blocked. So what the finished item is going to be, times it by the 48 inches, that was the target size, and I end up with 46.5, which would give me 4.5 inches of positive ease. So that means on each side, I'm going to have a couple inches of extra give. But remember, this pattern's looking for 6 to 10. I would really like to try it in that range. So if I then went up instead and did use the same needles, the 6.0mm needles, and knit the 52-inch size, which again would be size 5 instead of size 4, then the actual size is going to be 17. Again, I'm taking the pattern gauge, divide it by my actual gauge, multiply it by the finished bust of the pattern. It's going to give me about 50 inches, which gives me an 8 inches of positive ease because my bust is 42. I would end up with something that's 50. 50 minus 42 is 8 inches of positive ease, which what I love about that, it's in the target ease range here. So it's right in the middle. And also I'll be knitting one of the sizes that's in sort of the target size range based on what I would be doing if I had gauge. So because of both of those things, that's probably the direction I want to go in, as long as I'm okay doing a couple things. One of those things, I'm going to slide this out of the way, is I need to be okay with the fact that I'm going to rip this out. And I'm already okay with that fact. I think as knitters, sometimes especially newer knitters, sometimes you really don't want to rip it out because it's a lot of hard work, but you need to make a sweater that you're going to be happy with in the end. The other thing I considered is my daughter-in-law, basically. She would be great in this sweater, and it might be a decent size for her. So you can consider if you want to keep making it and gift it. But for me, I want this sweater. I want to try it. I want to have something. This yarn has been sitting in my stash for a year, and I've been waiting for the exact right thing to come along. So for me, I want this sweater. I'm going to rip this out. That's no problem to me. It's going to take no time at all to rip out. And then this is probably a few hours, I don't know, maybe 5 hours of knitting that I'm going to redo. No problem for me, but it is a choice. So if you choose a different path, that's fine. So one is being comfortable ripping this out. Otherwise, I could try to fudge it by like combining different sizes and doing a whole lot of math. And like, obviously I don't mind math, but I don't want to be doing math constantly throughout the pattern and feeling nervous about the end result. I want to just be able to make the pattern. So I'm doing all my math up front. The second thing, like I've already said, is you want to make sure that you're okay with the drape and the looseness of the fabric at that needle size. Like I have this to compare it to, which I have not blocked. I could wash this just to see what that fabric looks like, but I'm perfectly fine. I don't notice a difference between the two as far as one seeming, like this is obviously a little bit more denser. It's going to be a little less see-through, but this to me is perfectly fine. So I'm good with that. And then the other thing that you need to make sure is how much yarn you have. And so we kind of talked about it already. I have 4 skeins. This is one skein. It's 246 yards, I think. And I've used it to make this gauge swatch. But I only have 4 skeins. So I need to check on the actual pattern, the size that I'm going to make, how much yardage they have listed. I like to have extra yardage because I like to make things a little bit longer for my body type than a lot of patterns typically are built for, because a lot of them sort of sit the waist. Now this one already goes down pretty far, so I'm okay with that, but it should factor into the decision because on this one, I'm trying to remember exactly, but if I did the 48-inch sweater according to her pattern, then I would use 3.5 skeins. So that would give me a half skein buffer, which would be totally fine. And I know that she builds in, most pattern designers, not all, but most will actually build into their pattern an extra allowance. So like add 5 or 10% of the yarn just to make sure that, you know, for everyone who knits slightly differently and uses that more yarn, they still have a general idea of how much yarn they need. So I know that she builds in 5 to 10% buffer anyways. So if I do the 52 inch, which is what I'm going to do based on this, and I'll let you know if you want to follow me on Instagram, I'm sure you'll see my progress there and my finished results. But if I do her patterns 52 inches written, it's supposed to use, I think, about 3.9%. Oh, wait, not percent, 3.9 skeins, because I use the total yardage and I divide it by how many yards per skein to get my overall number of skeins. So it's going to use 3.9. So it might be cutting it close. So I might have to go to Megan, who dyed this yarn, and say, I might need one more, which luckily, hopefully she'd be flexible to do if I need it. But I really don't think I will need it because I'm pretty confident in my yardage and my math and my calculations, and knowing that there's a bit of buffer built into that. Hopefully I will come out with a sweater I love, that's the size I love, that gets worn the way that it's intended to look when it's finished, and that will fit me really nicely, and that I've spent all this time up front. Like, this time was wasted time. Let's be honest. What I should have done, and what you should do, caution, is I should have done a 5mm knitting needle gauge swatch like this. I just was too excited, and this happens all the time, and it's okay. But I did that. If I had done a 5mm swatch, I probably would have immediately realized I was going to be off too much on gauge. And then I could have done a 6mm swatch like this, and then I would have started the sweater properly. But I didn't, and that's okay. This is why we should swatch, but it doesn't mean that we have to, and it doesn't mean that we always will, right? One more little trick that I've heard other people say, but I thought it's worth highlighting, so that later on, if I want to use Bramble Ridge DK again, I have this swatch. I keep my swatches, and what I do is I tie knots in one of the yarn ends. Let me see if I can focus it for you. There we go. And I tie these knots in. I tie the number of knots as per the needle size. So this is a US 10. I've tied 10 knots in here specifically so that next time I can come back to this, and I'll label this swatch. I'll come back to this and I will actually put in, I'll know that, so I don't have to re-swatch it necessarily, although you might want to. Depends how consistent of a knitter you are. But that's just a little trick that I picked up from people on the internet and on YouTube and all that stuff, so that later I can come back to it and see roughly what my gauge is, depending on that. But I hope this helps. Again, we're not really talking about row gauge here. That's a whole other thing, but you do pretty much the same thing and try to figure out adjustments that way. But for stitch gauge, hopefully this helps, because I find it's one of those things that I think a lot of people find confusing when they're trying to figure out what does it mean when you get one number and the pattern has a different number. So this is me talking it through because I've done all the work and the math behind it. Doesn't take a long time, but sometimes it takes you a while to wrap your head around it. And just think logically as much as you can. Use math, use a calculator on your phone, which is what I do 90% of the time. If you don't have one of these, just use any ruler that has inches, and I recommend using something sharp and pointy so that when you're counting your stitches, you're not losing track of it. Because if you count wrong, you're going to end up with your math being wrong, and no one wants that. Hopefully this is helpful. I didn't think it was going to be 20 some minutes, but it is what it is. Have a great rest of the day. Happy crafting. And I hope that you are taking some time to do something that you love doing. That's it. That was an awful sign off, but whatever. I don't care. I'm going to have more coffee. Bye.